Hey, what's going on?
Not too much. Let's introduce ourselves. I'm Mark Schmitt. I'm a senior fellow at the Roosevelt Institute think tank, and I'm based in Washington. Most of my colleagues are in New York. And why don't you introduce yourself, Kevin?
I'm Kevin Williamson. I'm the deputy managing editor of National Review, and I've got a book out about socialism right now, which you should probably buy. And I'm wearing the silly mic, which makes me feel like I'm in rent, but here we are in the sweltering offices of National Review in New York City on a holiday with the air conditioning.
Okay, now you know, this is your first time doing blogging heads, and I think you're lucky because I'm a liberal, but I'm kind of a pushover, so it should be fine. Am I to take it that National Review doesn't observe the Memorial Day holiday?
Well, most of the office is off, but you know, the editorial schedule goes on when it goes on, so this is a publishing week for us. So
I know. I'm really just kidding.
We do it whether it's a holiday or not.
I'm doing some work, and you know, offices have many benefits, like places to steal office equipment, office supplies from, and places to get free air conditioning. So,
right, except
you know,
here.
not necessarily the worst place to be for that. I went ice skating yesterday to get some air conditioning that somebody else had paid for. So let's see. I wanted to talk for a second about. I think a few weeks ago. There was a little bit of talk about how, particularly after the capture of Osama bin Laden and a few other things, that kind of the silliness of, people like Donald Trump, who were kind of dominating some of the political discussion with real nonsense, would kind of fade away and we'd kind of move back to seriousness. And then I woke up this morning and I saw that the issue of Weinergate was dominating the headlines, followed only by the issue of Sarah Palin at the Rolling Thunder motorcycle rally in the traditional Memorial Day Veterans Rally in Washington. So it made me think that maybe silliness lives on, if only on the very hottest days of the year when people don't want to think about anything else. But it seemed like an interesting, particularly the right wing seems to have gone completely crazy over the idea that Representative Anthony Weiner tweeted a picture of his crotch area. I think the term in the Washington Post was his bulging crotch area to a young college student in northern Washington, and it's to me it seems like, okay, you got hacked. I mean, PBS got hacked last night. There's a lot of this going on, but apparently there's rather elaborate theories about how this about how real this is that seem to be consuming some segment of the political spectrum.
Yeah, I hope that he's telling the truth about that, and I hope that's what happened. I mean, if it's not, it's going to look really bad, of course, and given that his surname is what it is, it's going to be unbearable in terms of headlines, stupid jokes, late-night television humor, and all the rest of it. I mean, he is going to be the most famous congressman in the world if he actually has done what he says he hasn't. And again, I really hope this is just a prank that someone pulled. And as far as I know from the stuff I've looked at, I can't see any just real compelling reason to think otherwise.
Right.
Although, as I understand, there was the weird thing with the remark about that time in Seattle sort of thing, but. You know what I'm talking about, where
where there was another tweet where he said he was on Rachel Maddow. I can't believe. I mean, I spent like half hour reading this stuff today. I feel like I need that half hour.
You feel dirty now?
Maybe I shouldn't spend even more time on it now. But that he tweeted that he was on Rachel Maddow, and that whatever time it was 5:45 in Seattle, and isn't that the creation of conspiracy theories? I mean, it does feel like there's sort of an impulse on the right to like recapture that moment of maybe the Dan Rather, deciphering the Dan Rather fraudulent documents about George W. Bush's National Guard service or something like that, where now we'll dig into all the possible technological things that could go wrong with Twitter and how plausible or implausible a hacking is.
Yeah, we love a conspiracy.
Yeah,
who doesn't?
I guess that's
who
right.
doesn't?
I guess that's right.
You should see my email when I used to write about the Obama birth certificate stuff.
Right.
And I was one of the first people writing about just shut up and move on, because obviously it is what it is. And documentation of his birth has been fine for a long, long time. But people would get into serifs and type spacing and all the rest of the kind of stuff, and overlooking the normal sort of large things like, well, his birth was announced in the local newspaper, all that kind of stuff. So people just kind of go crazy on these things. But of course, if Weiner did do what he says he didn't do, well, that's a different story.
Right, but I mean, it's just a completely odd thing to do anyway, which is to publicly. I mean, if he said it, it was a public message. I mean, the young woman says she didn't get it. It was somebody else got it.
Yeah.
It was not a direct tweet. It was I don't know what it's called when you address.
Yeah, I guess the theory now is that he had meant to send it as a direct message, but actually made a public tweet out of it.
I have to say, I've never really understood. I feel really, really old because I've really never understood the business, which I guess does happen, and I'm not that much older than Anthony Weiner, but I've never understood the business of sending these pictures to women, which, we didn't have that opportunity when I was in the dating world, but, if we did, I couldn't really imagine doing it,
Yeah, you go out, you have a few drinks, and you make some bad decisions sometimes, but snapping a photo of yourself on the phone and sending it off some college girl when you're a married congressman, yeah, that's a bit much. I took Twitter off of my cell phone just for that very go.
Just to avoid that temptation.
Well, not the temptation to take lewd pictures of myself and send them out. But every now and then you're going home. It's 2:00 in the morning. You've had a few too many. You get some angry message from some guy who reads your magazine probably. Right. And is mad, and you're tempted to respond, with a bit too much. Right. And
there's a program, there's an app, that can force you to do a complicated math equation before you are allowed to send anything.
Yeah, I would never send one if that were the case.
That wouldn't work in midday, you mean?
Well, yeah, it would never happen. Yeah. I hate that stuff. So you mentioned Sarah Palin as well.
Yeah, just another sort of curiosity. It does seem like she's decided, maybe as these other Republican presidential candidates have dropped out, or perhaps with the rise of Michelle Bachmann to, the same particular niche, that she's actually suddenly looking more and more like a candidate than I thought she was, even just a couple weeks ago, and as usual, it's a completely chaotic. She sort of announced that she was going to ride in the Rolling Thunder, and sort of showed up with Todd and several of the kids riding motorcycles at the very front of the pack or something like that. It seems like it caused a fair amount of chaos.
I was just disappointed she wasn't on the front of the bike. She was riding in the passenger seat. She was riding pillion.
Right, behind.
That doesn't look like leadership.
That's not leadership, you're right. Sidecar leadership.
Yeah.
Sidecar leadership, Gerald Ford type of leadership, yeah.
Ford, yeah. So, yeah, she's starting to look like a candidate, though. She's got this movie coming out, and she's doing a bus tour and some other things. So it's an odd kind of candidacy if she is. I'm not familiar with any candidacies that started with movie launch previously. Maybe I missed one somewhere, Monroe or somebody. Right. But, yeah, it's kind of an interesting thing. The thing about Sarah Palin is that she'll be a really, really hard candidate to beat if she enters the Republican primary. And I think she would be harder to beat in the general election than a lot of folks on the left think that she would. Her people are very energetic. They are very loyal. They're loyal to her personally.
Right, but they're not 51% of the country.
No, but 51% of the country is not what you need. You need 51% of the voters.
Yes, they're not 51% of the voters. You'd have an incredible mobilization. It would give people on the left general ordinary Democrats would react to it very differently than they would, say, Barack Obama versus Mitch Daniels.
Yeah, probably, but everyone always predicts these kind of reactionary turnouts in situations like that, and they don't really normally materialize. There was a big thing made about the youth vote in Obama, and youth turnout that year was about the same as it was most years. It was up a little bit, but not really dramatically. So you know,
well, it was up. It was also up. It was up in '04 as well. So it was kind of a continuation of an upward trend. But it was pretty. It was pretty high by historical terms, and then of course dropped off again in 2010 as it.
Yeah.
That was
So anyway, I do suspect she would be not the pushover that a lot of people think that she would be. Now, whether she'd be a good president or not is another issue. But I think she'd be a heck of a tough candidate.
Well, that's an interesting prediction. I mean, she certainly would be in a fragmented Republican field, and I've always felt like there's, there doesn't seem to be, just from looking. I don't travel to Iowa and talk to caucus attendees and things like that, but just from looking at polls, it seems like there's just not just no enthusiasm for Mitt Romney, but really negative energy around Romney, and then nothing else that's really cohering. I'm kind of asked a number of conservatives, like, do people talk about Tim Pawlenty the way Democrats talked about Bill Clinton, Democrats who knew him, Democrats kind of that generation who'd been exposed to him, just gushed about Bill Clinton in, say at this point in 1991. I don't get the sense that anybody talks about Tim Pawlenty as, you may not have heard of him, but he's got awesome skills.
I don't think anyone talks about him.
Yeah, right, period. Obviously there's a pretty big vacuum
guy,
there.
Good resume, good skills, good outlook on things, but not the most exciting candidate ever. Of course, when your comparisons are guys like Daniels, of course, who's out now, and Romney, it's not hard to be Mr. Excitement in a field like that, but
right,
he's still not quite there. So, we actually had Pawlenty in here, National Review, a couple of days ago, come by and visit, and had an interesting conversation with him about some things. But, he still didn't even at that point strike me as the sort of guy that people are going to get just super, super excited about.
Right.
But, I like boring presidents myself. I would give $1 to see Calvin Coolidge back in office. That would be exactly my kind of guy. Just, shut up and keep things running and stop bad bills from being passed and kind of keep Leviathan on a leash. I think that would be good. I'm afraid of exciting candidates,
right?
And exciting politicians. I don't want people to be too enthused about government and governing.
Right. Well, I think there's actually a bit of a case for that. Even the level of enthusiasm around Obama was almost exceeded what was remotely possible, so that all the disappointment, which is all the disappointment that's followed, is related to the level of excitement and enthusiasm that was built up in 2008. So to some extent, I think we're getting an increasingly boring, moderately liberal president as time goes on, and I'm not totally against that either. I think that's something to sort of be ready for. I don't think you can kind of
one of the most beautiful things, the most delicious things for me in the last couple of years has been watching the left's crushing disappointment evolve slowly into bitterness and despair when it comes to what they thought Barack Obama was going to be and what he's actually turned out to be. And you could see it coming if you thought about it before the election. U.S. foreign policy really doesn't change radically from president to president.
Right.
Clinton came in saying, criticizing George H.W. Bush for kissing up to the butchers in Beijing, as he put it, and then 6 weeks later he was, oh gosh, we have to do business with these guys.
Right.
Obama was never going to close down Gitmo. He was going to get out of Iraq on the same schedule as George W. Bush, and get out of Afghanistan on the same schedule as everybody else. And, we got a guy who was the candidate to whom Goldman Sachs gave 70% of its political contributions. He's not going to probably be, a raging anti-capitalist radical the way some of his supporters had hoped he would.
Right. And I have to say, I thought there were I thought that he would be able to do more than he actually was able to do, or that Democrats put together were able to do. But I also, I just read a long coming out in the Boston Review fairly soon, a review of a bunch of books about Obama. And I started with an anecdote that when I was the editor of the American Prospect, shortly before the 2000 election, we had a cover story which was a picture of an empty Oval Office, and we had the headline, "The President Doesn't Matter as Much as You Think," and we had a bunch of articles about kind of the things that really don't change, and the independent power of the Federal Reserve, and the difficulty that Obama was going to have doing anything that had to run through the Senate Finance Committee, and both Democrats and Republicans on that committee, and Max Baucus in particular, and actually people were furious about the cover. They thought it wasn't appropriate to the moment when we were all about hope in the president. But it was absolutely important to recognize, even at that moment, that there was a lot of context that just isn't really going to move, and so the disappointment is actually totally intertwined with the overhype. But then that can't be that's not an excuse for not doing not fully in my view not fully using the power of the presidency to achieve those things. Now let me ask you a question: if the left is disappointed, really more or less people to my own left is disappointed that Obama didn't turn out to be, I guess, what did you call it, the battler against capitalism or something like that. How do you relate that to the overhyping? And as somebody who's written a book about socialism, which I haven't read yet.
And why not? I mean,
because I only just found out about it 2 days ago.
All right. Anyway, what was your
and I'm trying to read this new financial crisis book, no, I mean, how do you relate that sense that to the overhyping on the right of Obama as socialist, and the turning policy arguments about health reform and so forth into grand road to serfdom sort of showdowns?
Yeah, well, from my point of view, both of those things are true. Obama is not as different from, say, George W. Bush as his supporters had hoped he would be. And my version of that, or my take on that, is that there's a lot of socialism in the Bush administration too, in the sense of, not in the sense of carrying red banners and trying to nationalize the means of production and all that kind of stuff, but in the sense of having a federal government that aspires to impose a political plan on broad swaths of the economy. It was Bush who basically nationalized the banks for a little period of time there. It was Bush who, it was the Bush administration bailouts originally. They got a lot worse later on in the Obama administration, some aspects of them. So I would say both of those things are true. You've got left-wing socialism, you've got right-wing socialism as well. You've got Republicans who have these very grandiose plans about central planning on the energy market to get us off of nefarious foreign oil, because we can't trust those damn Canadians who sell us oil, and that sort of thing. So yeah, I think both of those things are true. I think that I would describe Barack Obama as basically socialist in terms of, I don't use that term pejoratively. I mean in terms of how I think he understands the relationship between the state and the economy. If he were a member of a European political party, he would probably be, in some forthrightly socialist party like the British Labour Party or something. But that doesn't make him all that much different from what came before, unfortunately.
Right. Well, then, who's not a socialist?
Oh, gosh. Well, I think Rand Paul has pretty good command on what the proper relationship between the state and the economy is. Unfortunately, he's not great on some other issues. The sort of libertarian wing of things is what I identify with, although unfortunately a lot of those guys are folks I don't really much want to identify with, like Ron Paul, who I think is right on most of the issues, but is just kind of a nut. And to a lesser extent, guys like Gary Johnson is a little more sound and sane than I think Ron Paul is, but still kind of, I think, lacks a sense of perspective. The problem, of course, when you're talking about government...
So Gary Johnson, actually, I'd like to go back to this later, but I want to finish this conversation. Sorry.
Oh, I was going to say, one of the problems, of course, when you're talking about the relationship between the government and enterprise is that the least free enterprise people in America are the Fortune 500. You've got a lot of big business that likes to have a great deal of government involvement in the economy as well, because they make money off it, they get guarantees, regulation keeps competitors out of the marketplace, and all the rest of that stuff. So, conservatives tend to see it as a conflict between business and government, between business and bureaucrats. But the truth is, it's a conflict between business and bureaucrats together versus everyone else.
Right. But I mean, if you define everybody as a socialist except for Rand Paul and maybe Gary Johnson, doesn't the term sort of lose any meaning? I mean, you basically got a whole range of people who are willing to use government in the economy, as one tool in their arsenal among many.
I have a very kind of specific definition of socialism that I work from, which is two things. It's the public provision of non-public goods. You understand public goods as defined in economics.
And I did, by the way, watch your interview on the National Review site about this topic. So
and using central planning to get that done. So you can have things like, I would describe the public schools in the United States as an instance of, socialist production and delivery of a particular product. That doesn't make you a socialist country. That doesn't make you a socialist if you're a principal at a public school, but you are, engaged in an enterprise that is, in its form, just as a matter of economics, socialist.
Right. So, I mean, in other words, you couldn't do much. A world that didn't have some elements of things that might be defined as socialist would be, life would be nasty, brutal, and short, right?
Oh, no, I don't think so. I think life would be a lot freer and richer and happier, but you certainly would have a lot less government and a lot less politics.
And possibly less education and maybe less healthcare.
Could we get a worse education system than we have?
What's that?
I mean...
Yeah, we sure could.
Oh, I doubt it. I think we'd be better off just locking the school doors tomorrow and burning all the records and firing all the employees.
And then how would people educate themselves?
Well, same way they always have. They would pay people to teach them things. They would read books. They would have tutors. There's all sorts of ways to educate them.
They'd be like John Stuart Mill with their... Okay. I mean, I think we've done. I mean, I think the investment that we've made in education. I mean, our education system. It gets disparaged all the time, but test scores have really increased. The level of what people are doing and learning is vastly higher than what it was in the 1950s or so, and it's necessary to get to that level in order to function in the economy we live in. So.
Yeah, but it's not necessary to have those services delivered by the state. In fact, you could probably do it better without that. And you would probably do a better job for the people who the public schools are most intended to help, which are the poor and economically vulnerable, who are the ones who are almost guaranteed to get a bad education in the current public school system.
Well, it's a system that actually educates 90% of folks. It's not like the public schools are just for poor people, and it's a way of it's simply a way of pooling all our resources and getting the schools we want. Now, there's plenty of room for a lot of competition, a lot of innovation within that system, and I live in D.C. where charter schools are I think about a quarter of the system now. It's not impossible to do it in different ways, but the mere fact of it being provided through collective action doesn't make it by its very nature bad, and probably makes it a lot better to create a universal system than something in which kind of.
What is it with you people in universal systems? That's my whole point. With this thing talking about planning and a desire to impose plans on things. Why should there be a universal system of education? Why should there be one model of education?
Well, there's not one model of education. We have a system in which every child gets an education.
No, we don't.
Every child goes to school.
We have a system in which maybe 40% of the kids get a real education. The rest of them just get locked up for 7 years.
Okay, I think that's a real misreading of the actual strengths of. I mean, there's a huge achievement gap. There are terrible schools, both urban schools, rural schools. Plenty of suburban schools aren't as good as they should be. But the real problem is really with 15% or so of the schools. The rest are, kids are taking AP classes. They've got GPAs of 6.4 or whatever, which doesn't represent nothing. I mean, obviously there's plenty of grade inflation, but I just don't think that's. I think that's that very casual kind of dismissal of everything that the government does that just isn't really fair to the tremendous strengths that are out there in our educational system.
Yeah, I don't see it, but maybe it's still live in the South Bronx. I don't know. The schools look like a mess there to me.
Right.
And Philadelphia was before, and D.C. where I was before, and
Right.
Austin where I was before.
Well, there are tremendous, in each of those, my daughter, who just pranced through in the background, goes to a D.C. public school, and it's a great school, and that's, it is doable in all those places, and there are definitely pockets of incredible strength in the South Bronx, and the challenge is spreading them more widely.
Well, congratulations on locating that pocket.
Anyway. You know what? I wanted to. I guess I had two things, and we could talk about either one. I was curious because you raised Rand Paul and Gary Johnson. I was curious a little bit of how you see that jockeying for the libertarian role in the Republican among the Republican candidates for president, and particularly about Johnson, who I don't think gets enough attention. And then I wanted to talk about kind of one of the elements of when we were talking before about the things that don't change, that never change. We want to talk a little bit about how the banks aren't changing.
Well, doing the libertarian outreach in the Republican Party is kind of like when you're running in the New Hampshire primary. It's good because you can meet everybody twice, because there are about 11, libertarians in the Republican Party or something.
Well, I mean, the Ron Paulite group has had a huge presence in 08.
Yeah,
those are the people who maybe you just see them more because they comment on blogs and do things like that. But there's definitely an intensity that makes it feel large. And I think in the wake of Tea Party and a bunch of other things that went on, it's hard to imagine that. And given the magnitude of the reaction to Obama, it's hard to imagine.
The thing about Ron Paul is that he didn't catch fire as a libertarian candidate. He caught fire as an anti-war candidate.
Right.
Most of his support was tied to the unpopularity of the Iraq War and tied to the unpopularity of George W. Bush.
Right.
And he was the guy you could go to be anti-Bush and anti-war if you didn't want to be on the left, if you didn't want to be a Democrat, an Obama supporter.
Yeah.
And now that energy has dissipated, I think a lot of the Paul movement has as well. I don't hear his name come up as much. I don't think his following is quite as strong, quite as animated as it was. Doesn't seem to be raising as much money as he did. I don't think his candidacy is going to do almost anything this time around. Gary Johnson is a little bit more of a libertarian purist,
right?
Than Ron Paul is, rather.
Right. You got to have the drug. You got to have the drugs in the mix.
Got to have the drugs in there, which I'm in favor of. So that's good. But the thing, here's the difference, is that Johnson has made things like drug decriminalization and those sorts of social issues a big part of his campaign. Whereas Ron Paul spent a lot of time talking about, well, maybe we shouldn't have fought World War II. I don't know. Or I guess it's World War I. I'm sorry. I never said that about World War II. Don't want to mischaracterize him. The fact that Johnson is less of a foreign policy focus, spends less time talking about the empire and all that sort of irresponsible rhetoric that you hear from guys like Ron Paul, I think makes him a more appealing candidate in some ways. I don't think he's going to go anywhere because he and Ron Paul are both sort of racing to the left on immigration. They're both kind of open borders, pro-amnesty, comprehensive reform, as it's known, guys. And that's a killer issue on that side of the political fence, because oddly enough, most of the people who are strongly attracted to libertarian politics tend to be very restrictionist when it comes to immigration.
Right.
So they believe in libertarianism within one country, not as an international order.
Right.
And I think, and also because they tend to be concentrated in the Southwest, where the consequences of large-scale unchecked illegal immigration are most apparent. It's going to make it hard for either of them to take a real toehold. I think we've got a chance for a surprise candidate is a guy like Rick Perry, who is very strong on immigration. He's very much a traditionalist conservative in style and substance, but he has a lot to appeal to that libertarian element. He's anti-Washington, he's anti-Fed, he's anti-bailouts, he's kind of anti-government overreach in general, and a very smart guy and a very politically savvy guy. And I'm trying to I'm kind of trying to encourage him to get into the race because, of course, what he's really waiting for is for me to encourage him.
Well, there does seem to be he does seem to be getting a lot of encouragement.
Yeah. He's got a great record to run on.
Yeah. All right. Well, I guess that's interesting to me because I would have thought that the Fed and bailout issues kind of gave Ron Paul a little bit of a head of steam that might be useful to another sort of libertarian type candidate as well. But I guess the point that somebody who's less identified as being part of that kind of marginal group and is actually more of a mainstream Republican with libertarian credibility probably has a better chance of filling that niche.
Yeah, and I think the anger over the bailouts and the rest of that stuff has subsided past the point of being politically very useful anymore to guys like Ron Paul.
Right.
People are a lot more worried about jobs right now.
Right. What's Rick Perry's job record like?
What's that?
What's Rick Perry's job record like in Texas? I guess.
Texas in the last 10 years has created about 755,000 new private sector jobs. The second place state is Arizona with less than 100.
Okay, all right.
So pretty good.
I shouldn't have asked that without knowing the answer. This is why.
Perry has probably. Well, I mean, let's not pretend like the governor's responsible for all the job creation in Texas.
No.
He's not. But Texas,
I think one thing
under Perry's governance has probably a better record for employment growth during a nasty recession than any other state ever.
Right. Mostly low wage and not covered by
insurance. No, not at all. Texas, the median household income in Harris County, which is where Houston is higher than the median household income in New York. A lot of energy sector jobs. There's manufacturing in Texas, high-end services. There are more corporate 500 headquarters in Texas now than there are in New York. So no, it's not all people picking peaches for $3.
All right. Let's talk a little bit about. You sent me a Bloomberg article about basically how the big banks are bigger than ever, and Mark Mobius of Templeton Investments predicting essentially the makings of another crisis, which of course some of my colleagues at the Roosevelt Institute, like the people who blog on New Deal 2.0, have been making similar arguments for a while. I'm wondering what where that leads you in thinking about policy.
Quit bailing out losers. Let markets work and let banks fail. Look, we would have had a much nastier time of it in 08 and 09 if we had just let the banks fail. And it wasn't really a choice between doing something and doing nothing. It was a choice between having Ben Bernanke bail out and Nancy Pelosi bail out. And I think for those of us who are free market guys who dislike, in general, government intervention in the economy, we got the better deal on that.
Because you got Bernanke's bailout?
Because we got one that was, relatively speaking, well designed and well implemented. Now the GM stuff and the AIG stuff is going to be a nightmare forever. The foreclosure prevention stuff that got attached to it's going to cost gazillions of dollars. But what we got was we propped up these institutions with borrowed money, saw them through the rough spot, got paid back. TARP, as such, worked out pretty well, all things considered. But we haven't taken the necessary next steps after that, I think, which is to unwind the government's involvement in this, particularly unwind the government's involvement in the mortgage market, in the market for mortgage securities, and also make it clear under whatever new regulatory apparatus that we set up that there aren't going to be future bailouts. And what we did instead was we got the Dodd-Frank bill, which creates this kind of all-powerful regulator, but it doesn't really do a lot in terms of establishing really clear, stable, fixed rules for what it does and how it does it. It just kind of says, well, here's some smart people we're going to put in the room and hope they do things right. And that's the approach that always gets you into trouble. I think we could probably solve 80% of what we want to solve in terms of regulating large financial institutions with simply higher capital requirements. That you don't let them get as leveraged up. You make them hold more capital proportional to their investments and their exposure. And then you let them sink or swim. It's not really so much people making bad investments or making risky investments. that caused the trouble, it was the leverage attached to that stuff. And so I think, leverage limits and higher capital requirements will get you basically where you want to be in terms of regulation.
And I think that, one of the advantages of something like higher capital requirements is it doesn't require that dynamic where you have regulators who the people on Wall Street look down on with contempt because they're basically people who are supposed to understand the same things they do but get paid 1/10 as much, and so obviously are less than 1/10 as smart, or probably aren't in fact 1/10 as smart, but are treated as if they are and don't have access to, will struggle to get even the basic information that they need. Capital requirements are a pretty clean, straightforward way of dealing with that. And there are games that get played around capital requirements, but they don't.
But it's pretty easy math
of regulatory intervention.
Yeah. I'd like to see that happen, and we have to shut down Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. We have to liquidate those portfolios, and they are dens of corruption. They are the worst sort of nexus between finance and politics. And instead, they're growing. And you've got the realtors and the builders and all the other people who basically want to reinflate the housing bubble. And as long as you're subsidizing risk and subsidizing interest rates, you're subsidizing real estate, and you're trying to reinflate the bubble, which is going to be a mess.
Well, there's reinflating the bubble, and there's creating a basic market for fairly standard, what would have been 30-year fixed-rate mortgages, and maybe now are a little more nuanced than that. That there still has to be a role for that, and Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac played a big role in making that possible, and there's still a role for them to do.
Yeah, I don't think so. I don't think if there's not a natural market for the mortgages, then there's no market for them. So don't create one.
Well, you still
create a market where no market exists.
Well, because that market actually did work to get people into homes for 30 years. It's when they got into crazy stuff. It only became a problem when they felt like we have to fight for our privileged position, which means we need to keep a larger and larger share of the mortgage market because we're competing with these other guys, and they started to take particularly a lot of the Alt-A.
I don't. Well, that's not the whole thing, because what's the problem with what Fannie and Freddie did in their business model, and our whole way of thinking about real estate is that real estate is this magical product, the price of which only goes up.
Right.
We treat it as an investment vehicle when it's really not a very good one in most places, in most cases. And so we had a situation in which the median home price in most cities had gone up 300% in real terms in 15 years or something like that.
Right.
And that's a direct result of government monkeying with the market, particularly with the market for mortgages and mortgage risk. And the more you have those sorts of interventions, the more you're going to have those sorts of outcomes.
Okay. Most of what a lot. I think far more of the inflation, based on the FCIC reports and other things, far more of that bubble was driven by subprime and other things that the private sector was doing that would have happened with or without Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and they were a smaller portion of that, and they sort of felt like they had to get into it and keep up with that game. They're definitely not blameless in the game, but they're not the primary. Only Peter Wallison tells a story in which they are the primary actors.
I don't think they're not the exclusive ones, but in terms of things you can do in politics, in terms of government policies you have out there, you've still got the government running these government-sponsored enterprises, backing them up with an unlimited line of credit of the U.S. Treasury and all the rest of it. That's something government can do. Government can say, we're going to sell off these portfolios and shut these agencies down and let the market handle its own mortgages. Government can do that. There's lots of stuff that it wants to do that it's actually not able to, but you can shut down a government agency.
Right.
Fairly simple matter of policy.
You can, especially now that they are more clearly government agencies and not quasi-independent.
Make-believe private agencies.
Private agencies. But if you did that, if you take the article that you sent me from Bloomberg, and it talks about banks getting bigger and getting back into more arcane products and things like that. If you define that as the problem and you just wipe out Fannie and Freddie and liquidate their portfolios, how does doing that solve the first problem? Are are these huge, Goldman and J.P. Morgan Chase and so forth, are they any more secure as a result of doing that?
Oh no, I don't think so. I mean, the banks and their shenanigans are a separate issue. I mean, they're related issues to the extent that they were intertwined with Fannie and Freddie because of the mortgage derivatives. But no, I mean what the banks do and what the banks get up to and their business practices are a separate issue. I think we could do better regulation of than they do. I think we do much simpler regulation, as I mentioned, mostly through capital requirements and leverage limits. A few other things that should probably be done as well. But no, just what you need to do is, in general, reduce, I think, the government's footprint in the world of finance and let those things sort themselves out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. I guess we want to talk quickly about some of the budget issues. I spent a day last week at the fiscal summit sponsored by the Peterson Foundation.
Mm-hmm.
One of there's an organization affiliated with the Roosevelt Institute, the Roosevelt Campus Network, a group of college students, did a fantastic job putting together one of the 5 budget proposals that was presented at that summit, produced by 3,000 college students, and put up on the stage against something that was produced by 3 budget wonks at AEI or 5 wonks at Center for American Progress. Quite an impressive proposition, but it did make last week kind of budget week, and I don't have any super profound insights about that. I know some people who think that we should not be worrying about any of this nonsense at all, and
who are those people?
Well, I mean, there's a set of arguments that are not entirely wrong. One is that the more we're talking about long-term deficit now, the more we're not talking about the economic stimulus we need now. That's one argument. That's essentially a political argument. There's another argument that says, we can deal with long-term issues at the time. That says, once it says, so many of the projections, CBO projections, are not actually accurate. That they assume too high an interest rate, and so forth. There's another that says we can, defining it as rather than defining it as a deficit problem, define it as a health cost problem, which is absolutely right, and deal with it as a health cost problem, as system-wide health inflation problem. That's a set of arguments. I think it's fine to incorporate some of those points, such as, yes, we do still need economic stimulus, and we definitely don't need spending cutting in the current fiscal year. Yes, everything we're talking about, the center of it is healthcare spending and revenues, and it's not entitlements as a general topic. I mean, I think it's possible to incorporate all those ideas and still say, okay, here's a way of addressing the long-term federal fiscal problem in a fair and constructive way.
Yeah, how can you say it's not entitlements when, obviously healthcare is a big part of the entitlements through Medicare and Medicaid, but also Social Security. Those 3 unfunded entitlement liabilities run to $100 trillion.
Right. Well, the only way you really put Social Security is a totally different model, partly because it's essentially its own. It's a self-contained program, so it's not actually driving the deficit.
Except it's cash
the changes are super easy to fit. It's pretty easy to bring it into balance, and you're projected. That is a 75-year projection. Medicare becomes a pretty big problem pretty soon. Social Security becomes a small problem soon, and only becomes a significant problem if you're projecting out as far into the future as Social Security has already existed from the past. Mm-hmm. So nobody was projecting 75 years of Social Security at the time it was created. To project it out in those terms now is unnecessary. So yeah, there are 3 things. There's no reason why we can't. Each of those 3 things can be dealt with as their own issue. Each of them is a significant program, and Social Security's problems are the least of them. So entitlements are what you deal with when you deal with the long-term. When you're dealing with long-term fiscal policy, what you deal with whenever you have a big budget deal, you deal with entitlements and you deal with revenues, because those are the things that you change kind of by changing the rules. Everything else in government, we could just, you want to spend 20% less on defense tomorrow? or in the next fiscal year. Just set that in the budget, and that's what you're going to spend, or Pell Grants, or whatever, or anything else that's discretionary. So yeah, we have to deal with entitlements, but there are three, and they're different.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean that's certainly true. But because they're different doesn't make Social Security unimportant. But moving on from there, yeah, I would agree with you that Social Security is the easiest fix of the big three. You raise the retirement age, you means test it, you do some other things, and
raise the payroll cap, partially raise the payroll tax cap, include some other sources of income into the payroll tax cap. I mean, there's other.
Yeah, that wouldn't be my choice, but yeah, you could.
It might not be your choice, but all of those are relatively manageable and not massively socialistic acts.
Well, yeah, I mean the whole program is, but that's another conversation. But
that's another country.
What's that?
That's another country.
Well, maybe that's you.
It doesn't. Yeah.
But Medicare, I don't see a real good way out.
Right.
It doesn't look like the sort of thing that's going to be amenable to a very easy fix. I mean, IPAB probably is not going to do the things that they say it's going to do in terms of reducing healthcare spending, healthcare costs, that sort of thing. I don't think you can raise taxes. Probably.
I mean, that's a guess. I mean, you might be right about that. Advocates of it might. I mean, it may or may not do those things.
Right.
It certainly has a lot of different tools, and there are a lot of creative ideas out there.
Go back and look at the budget projections for Social Security, or not Social Security, but Medicare, when the program was created, and see what it was supposed to be costing every year by this point.
Right. Actually, I just saw those this morning for something else.
And it's 52 times that or something.
Well, I think there's an interesting question about if we'd had anything like the computing power that we have now in 1965, would we have ever created Medicare?
Yeah.
I mean, there was really no capacity to project something like that out. And I said that somebody told me there was actually more than I realized. But I mean, a lot of things were pretty improvisational at that time.
You could put a number on the fatal conceit a little more quickly at that point than you could now.
Right. Well, I mean, now we put numbers on them, and we assume a certain amount of certainty. You go to the CBO and you say, I need a number for X, and the one option that CBO doesn't have is to say nobody knows. They have to give you a number.
Yeah.
And then it's a CBO number, and some CBO numbers are pretty clear cut. I mean, I actually think some Social Security projections are. Some parts of them are pretty clear-cut. I mean, we kind of know how many people are going to turn 65 in 2040 because all those people are alive now, and whatever they were born in 1975, whatever. I mean, or 1965. We know what that 75. Some things are known, and some things are really off the cuff projections.
Yeah. And
it's good to have the capacity to do them, but we put too much importance in that projection.
Yeah, well, one thing we don't have to project is where we are, which is 14.7 trillion in the hole.
Right, which is if we stabilize our debt to GDP ratio at about bring it down from where it is right now, but which it will go down anyway. We can stabilize that at 60% of GDP, which more or less, one of the interesting things in the Peterson Budget Summit was that the budget plan from the college students of the Roosevelt Campus Network brought the total debt to about 60% of GDP, and the budget plan from the American Enterprise Institute was just a couple percentage points below that. They kind of converged at about the same point. AEI's plan obviously gave a lot more away in taxes. The Roosevelt plan did a lot more with spending, but it was kind of interesting to see that, that kind of left-right convergence on a total level of debt that would be manageable.
And what were the targets for spending cuts the kids came up with?
I don't have it offhand.
Okay. And what did they think about taxes? Do you remember?
They created a new structure of taxes that would be linked to shares of income, kind of a new set of brackets that would result in a cut from the CBO baseline for I think 90% of people. But then they had I think they had a millionaire surtax and they had one other bit that I'm kind of forgetting.
Yeah.
But obviously they're raising revenues, which
Yeah.
you and I were talking earlier. I think there's maybe we're coming around to some point where there's some agreement that you can't refuse to raise revenues.
Yeah,
or actually keep cutting
for
taxes
a libertarian
if you take
type,
this problem seriously.
I'm uncommonly open to tax increases at this time because I think the debt and deficit are just such a dangerous issue. I don't think that I think the American national debt is different from other national debts because we're such a large share of the world economy. We are such just a large economy, period, in absolute terms, that no one really knows, what sort of debt to GDP ratio we can bear and what it will look like when it comes unwound.
Right now we're bearing a lot without it having any impact on interest rates. So that's part of the argument for not worrying about the deficit. That makes a lot of sense too. It's just there's no sign of lack of confidence. But your point is absolutely right. We don't know when that switch flips. Obviously, there is some. There's a lot that we can get away with that even the UK can't get away with, but at some point that changes and we don't quite know where it is.
Yeah, and you don't want to find out. That's the thing.
Right.
You really don't want to get to the point. So, what I sort of liked were the tax proposals in the Simpson-Bowles proposal, which are a tax increase, but they're a lot like the tax cut in the Paul Ryan proposal, which is to say that they lower tax rates, but get rid of a bunch of exclusions, deductions, and things like that. Simpson-Bowles model is a net tax increase, Ryan's a net tax cut. But I think that's a pretty good model for getting it done. Right. And I think that a lot of Republicans would probably be open to something like that if it were part of an overall deal that reformed the tax code and got our public finances back into something that more closely resembles Sandra.
Right. Well, I'm an old tax reformer, so I'm all for getting rid of tax exclusions and worrying less about rates and more about the base, including capital gains, including the special treatment of capital gains. So maybe there is it's been a long every year, and you hear this. Maybe this is the year where there's an opportunity for some bipartisan movement on tax reform along those lines, and every year it isn't. But maybe after at a certain point, sort of exhaustion sets in, and Grover Norquist, is vaporized, and we're able to get back to that conversation where once you're able to have that conversation, even if you're not really doing that much with rates or just let the rates go back up to pre-Bush tax cut levels, being willing to talk about tax expenditures at that point, there's a lot that can be done and a lot of room for actual agreement.
And which also goes back to the housing bubble thing, because mortgage interest deduction is a killer both on the revenue side and on the market distortion side.
Absolutely.
I'd love to get rid of that.
The problem with the mortgage interest deduction is that it becomes a very significant increase on essentially an arbitrary number of people, an arbitrary set of people who are kind of earlier in their mortgage.
Yeah.
It's definitely one of those where the pain is huge for some people. It's far bigger than the impact of the 3 percentage point increase on people earning $250,000 and over that people went bananas over, which in some cases would amount to just a couple $100 for fairly wealthy families. You have to sort of phase in an elimination of the mortgage interest tax deduction. Unfortunately, I think just because of the enormous impact on a lot of households.
Yeah, I think you would probably do it over the course of 10 years or something like that.
I'm for it. I'm not against it. I'm for it, but it's a whopper.
Yeah, it's a big one. But if we agree on that, maybe we can get someone else to agree on it too.
Okay, that sounds good. Well, that seems like a good way to end this Memorial Day Blogging Heads, and good luck with getting your next issue of your magazine out.
All right, take care.
Okay, thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.